there's a lot to learn just from how they think about it, the discipline with which they approach it, and they prepare their people tactically, give them the tools they need to carry out the tactics, and then move on to the next issue.
Joining us now is Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Thomas Ricks, joining to talk about his book on military history, military strategy of the Civil Rights Movement. It is called Waging a Good War, A Military History of the Civil Rights Movement from 1954 to 1968. I do have to admit that I have not finished the book, but what I have read has been very intriguing. I very much will be finishing this, and there's a lot to learn. As in your introduction, as you're talking about, that this is that the military lens of the Civil Rights Movement is never really even even recognized, much less kind of delved into in the depth that you have in this 300 some odd page book. And so looking forward to the conversation. Appreciate your time. Could you introduce yourself for the audience? Talk to us about some of your work.
My name is Tom Ricks. I used to be a journalist. I'd say more I'm now a book author for the last decade or so. I think this book is the best book I've written. It's almost the sum of my knowledge. And it goes to exactly what you were just talking about at this the convention. As I was listening to you, I was thinking, this is what the Civil Rights Movement, the classical Civil Rights Movement, was so good at. Not just exhorting people, not just inspiring them to action, but giving them the tools of action. Remember, what they would do is they say, when you get home, this is what you are going to do. This is how you can do it. They had very specific schools down at Dorchester, Georgia. They would say, this is how you make a long-distance phone call. This is how you talk to a racist sheriff about your First Amendment right to peacefully protest and to petition the government for change, that you have an absolute right to do that under the Constitution. What they did was teach confrontational nonviolence. I think it's a much better word than passive resistance. It wasn't passive at all. It was about grabbing the opposition, the enemy, by the lapels and not letting go. What's striking to me about it, it wasn't about mass numbers. They were inspired by Gandhi, who said he'd much rather have a small group of disciplined protesters than a large group of undisciplined ones. Remember Gandhi's Salt March, very famous in the 1930s. He marches to the sea against British imperialism and for Indian independence. It was less than 100 people. Now, crowds of 50,000 would meet them at certain places, come out to welcome them. But it was an incredibly small, disciplined force. And I think this goes to the labor movement today. The thought that, first of all, we have to be trained and well organized. Second, we have to be disciplined in everything we do. And third, we have to be sustainable. One of my favorite people in the entire civil rights movement is James Lawson, who trained a lot of people in Nashville, who went on to become kind of the working level leaders of the classical civil rights movement, people like John Lewis, James Bevel, Diane Nash. And he taught them the key to a successful protest movement is not one big demonstration, it's several intense, smaller demonstrations. What really terrifies the opposition is not the big one, it's the fact that you're coming back again tomorrow and the day after and the day after. So in a nutshell, what I'd say is the civil rights movement was not about passive resistance. It wasn't about bop me on the head, I don't care. It was, if you bop me on the head, I will be back tomorrow and I'll be back with another person. And if you bop us both on the head, on the third day, there'll be three of us. And day after day after day. I think Birmingham there in Alabama with you was the classic example of this. The big civil rights demonstrations there in the spring of 1963 filled the jails, overwhelmed the city. and imposed a cost on Birmingham that Birmingham is still paying. This confrontational nonviolence said, what we will do is impose cost on you that you cannot imagine, that you know how to use violence. The American power structure, the caste system, is fluent in the use of violence, but you don't understand nonviolence. You won't understand what we're doing, and ultimately, we will prevail without you ever understanding what we're doing.
You talked, there was a lot there, and talking about, the importance of strategy and discipline. And I think that is the discipline and the knowledge of, how to interact with police. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? When are we going to do it? When are we going to stop? Why are we doing it? This is all so absent from most of the protests that you're going to see today about basically any topic. Somebody, there was a call to come out to, to the courthouse. And so that's what people do. There's very, very little, if any, of this kind of preparation or idea about how we want to do what we want to do it, and evaluation after it's over about whether we met our goal, right? We do some of this stuff in the labor movement. And I'm sure that you're familiar with, organizer trainings, and you mentioned role playing in the book. Mm-hmm. And I didn't realize that, they did this in the civil rights movement, but that's something that we do in our organizer trainings. We, pretend to be, scared workers, anti-union workers, antagonistic workers, passively supportive workers. And we're trying to move these people into our support base, up the ladder of engagement, so to speak. But all of that is kind of in the vein of strategy that is not really, you mentioned it's been kind of overlooked, and the way that it is parallel to strategies of war and military has been kind of overlooked. Why do you think that is, and what do you think actually diving into it like you have can teach protest movements today and, the labor movement?
In my most cynical moments, I think that if you actually taught the civil rights movement accurately in American schools, it would lead to a political upheaval in this country that the power structure greatly fears. If you taught how they actually worked, how they thought, what they did, it would almost be an instruction manual in recreating a more progressive America. You mentioned strategy, and I think that's really key. In some ways, demonstrations were the least important aspect of the civil rights movement. And though I'm a former journalist, I do kind of blame the media for that, because that's what they focused on, the public manifestation. In many ways, the demonstration was the least important. The one thing you really don't want to do is have a big demonstration and not repeat it, not have a next step for people to follow through on. So strategy. I think the civil rights movement actually excelled in strategy and was and better at strategy than the U.S. military was. The U.S. military is very good tactically. They know how to fight. They know how to engage in a battle, but their leaders don't have a very good idea of strategy. What do you do after you get to Baghdad? What's the plan for the next day? And in fact, America's generals like Tommy Franks kind of shuffled that off and said that's someone else's problem. In fact, that is the key question for generals. And it was also the key question for early civil rights leaders as they trained and prepared and did this role playing and so on. The first question in strategy in the civil rights movement, and I think they were extremely good at this, was who are we? It sounds like such a basic question, but it's incredibly difficult. There's an old saying among military strategists, if you're not crying, you're not making strategy. Strategy is hard. So the question, who are we? Diane Nash, who is a young college dropout in Nashville. She moved into the YWCA, the segregated one for Black people in Nashville, to work full-time on civil rights. And the way she put it was, we are people who will no longer tolerate segregation. We will not live a segregated life. And people would respond to her, Diane, the South is segregated. What are you going to do about it? She said, that's their problem. I'm not going to live a segregated life anymore. What that meant was, we're going to walk into segregated lunch counters in downtown Nashville and ask for our lunch. And it was much more than being about a hamburger. It was saying, we will not live a segregated life. And from that flows a lot. As you see, from that flows tactics. Once you have your strategy right, tactics become much easier. Diane Nash, trained by James Lawson, after months of preparation, of role playing, of people where they'd sit in church basements and they would have, one group would be the protesters, the other people be people attacking them. To prepare for the sit-ins, they had coffee poured on them, chairs kicked out from underneath them, cigarettes put out on their backs. They went in well trained, and the people who really did attack them did exactly that, but they were trained for it. They were prepared for it. They did not fight back. And this shocked America, and it shocked the South. Who are these kids who are not fighting back, who are doing something very different, who are speaking a language of nonviolence that flummoxes the power structure? And that inspired people to try to learn how to do that. Other people learned how to do sit-ins, and that leads directly to the freedom rides. A year later, Diane Nash, her then husband, James Bevel, are key in the freedom rides and saying, we're going to get on buses and ride through the segregated South and not obey the laws of segregation. And again, they did training, they did preparation. They actually sent out advanced scouts to reconnaissance the route to say, when you go to this bus station, the segregated white waiting room will be on your left and the segregated black waiting room will be on your right. Go in and take a left. Sit down in that room, black and white together. The preparation, the thinking through, it was almost as if the demonstration was irrelevant. By the time you went to the demonstration, you had a cadre of trained people who had talked through all this, who understood who they were, who trusted each other, and could go through the fight together. And then, as you say, sit down after it and said, okay, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? And what's the next step?
Right, right. And what do you think is gained by that last bit? What is the most important thing that is gained by actually, after an event or a demonstration or a sit-in, going back and seeing like, okay, how do we feel about that? Did we meet the goal? What are things we can improve on? What are things that we did well? Like, what is the benefit of that?
The benefit is you're able to change and adjust and improve and do better and do different. You constantly keep the opposition on the back foot. You're not predictable. They don't understand what you're doing. The assurances that the opposition have given their leaders in the power structure fall through. So Birmingham, spring of 1963 is a good example. Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, and Fred Shuttlesworth begin demonstrations in the spring of '63. The demonstrations actually are smaller than they expected in Birmingham. They're a little bit worried by it. And King ultimately calls in James Bevel. Bevel is a person who should be better known, a brilliant strategic thinker, a young Baptist minister training in Nashville, and also someone who was deeply imbued with the works of Gandhi. He had studied Gandhi closely, as James Lawson had. James Lawson actually had gone to India to study Gandhi's approach to demonstrations. So Martin Luther King calls up James Bevel and says, Bevel, I need you in Birmingham. Things aren't going well here. Bevel arrives and says, okay, here's the problem. In Birmingham, the adults are afraid to demonstrate, and for a good reason. You essentially have a totalitarian system here. The police will crack down on them, they will lose their jobs, and they will suffer economically, and they are already living on the edge here. So Bevel comes up with a different approach. He says, I'm going to recruit high school students and even younger elementary school students. And I'm going to fill the jails of Birmingham. And that imposes a cost on the city while not imposing a cost on the adults of Birmingham that we're asking to demonstrate who can't afford to do so. And Bevel is also innovative in how he recruits. He doesn't just go stand on street corners and say, hey, kid, you want to be a demonstrator? He goes to the two most popular DJs on black radio stations in Birmingham, Tall Paul and I think Shelley the Playboy. And he explains to them what they're doing and says, I want you to go on the radio and invite the student leaders, cheerleaders, presidents, club presidents, football captains, quarterbacks. Come on down to a lunch and I want to talk to those kids. And then he uses those kids to recruit more. And he finds the kids can't say, Mommy and Daddy, I'm going to a demonstration. Parents won't allow it. But if the kids say, I'm going to church, the parents can't stop it. You can't tell your kid not to go to church. So every night they're holding training sessions in church. And Martin Luther King comes back to Birmingham and says, Bevel, what have you been doing? And Bevel says, I'm ready to go on the street with hundreds of kids. And King doesn't believe it. He says, really? And he says, King says, show me. And so Bevel takes him into the 16th Street Church in Birmingham and says, this room is filled to the rafters. Kids, tell Dr. King, are you ready to demonstrate? Hold up your hand. And every single kid in the room holds up their hand. 1,000 kids maybe at that point. And King says, I can't believe it. And Bevel says, we're doing it. And they start marching out in cohorts. He has planned it. They have planned the route. They said, this group is going to go this many blocks. This group is going to go that many blocks. By 7 minutes, you're going to be at this spot. And they never almost make it to 7 minutes because they get arrested. Very soon, the jails of Birmingham are packed. And this has got the local police on the back foot. Bull Connor, the chief of security for the city of Birmingham, doesn't know what to do. And so he says, I can't arrest anybody more. I filled up the jails. I actually filled up the fairground outside Birmingham with more kids. And then more kids keep on marching and more. And Bull Connor makes a fateful decision. He, at that point, calls out the fire hoses and the police dogs and sets them on kids, some of them as young as 8 years old. Now, the city of Birmingham wasn't surprised by this. That's what you do, the city of Birmingham, the white power structure, had been assuring the rest of the country, don't worry, we know how to handle black people. We're familiar with them. We grew up with them. And then the nation sees fire hoses and police dogs attacking children and says, if that's the way you handle black people, if you handle what you call the colored problem, we're not buying it. We're not going to live with that. And this is a great strategic triumph for the civil rights movement, really brought about by James Bevel, considering the situation and saying, let's take a different route, a different step here, and preparing these kids for it. The kids knew exactly what to expect. There's a great interview I read with a woman, now quite old, who was 8 years old, being held by the police. And the police started asking her about communism and Marx. She said, we didn't talk about that stuff. We talked about our rights. This is preparation. The police were taken aback. These kids were serious. So there's a lot to learn just from how they think about it, the discipline with which they approach it, with which they think through strategy, and that leads to tactics, and they prepare their people tactically, give them the tools they need to carry out the tactics, and then move on to the next issue.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate. Why do you think it is? What was it that led them to come upon the tactic of nonviolence? All these demonstrations, it's all nonviolence and purposeful and aggressive and all of this, but it is all, that's kind of the marker of the civil rights movement, is that it's nonviolence. What was it that brought them to that? Yeah,
and I got to say, it's confrontational nonviolence. It was a way of dealing with a very violent system. And this was the problem, especially in the South, but across America. The American power structure is fluent in the use of violence. You had to find a different way to confront it than with violence. And Gandhi was a very inspiring example. They looked to Gandhi. They learned a lot from Gandhi. I think the key bridge was the Black church, the Black Baptist church in the South especially. The Black church had not been active in civil rights, but looking at Gandhi, could say, yes, there's a religious aspect here that we can possess, we can own. And the Black church steps up in the late 40s and early 50s in the South in a way it had not before. And I think this is probably the historical accident of World War II. Ralph Abernathy was a World War II veteran. Medgar Evers was a World War II veteran. Somebody who should be better known, Amzie Moore, a brilliant resistance leader in Mississippi, was another veteran of World War II. And so I think they saw that the military structure was useful. They saw the Black church was now willing to enter into this area for the first time to push the issue of civil rights. And the moment came together with this generation of young people. 1 million Black Americans had served in the armed services in World War II, most of them from the South. And they were ready, they were willing, and yes, they also could resort to violence. One place down south of Nashville, Columbia, Tennessee, right after World War II, had some violent confrontations. And the police there were shocked that the young Black men there, almost all of them veterans, knew how to use firearms, knew how to fight in a combat formation, and were willing to do so to protect their neighborhoods.
And if you had, all of this is really, like you mentioned at the start of the interview, this is all really understudied and understood, especially in the schoolhouse telling of the civil rights movement. In particular, the thing that I think of most as kind of the archetypal example is Rosa Parks. It was just spontaneous. She was tired, no other reason. And then spontaneously, additionally, everybody came out and supported her in the Montgomery bus boycott. And this was all spontaneous, right? And you said that, you think that if people actually understood how this all happened, then it would better prepare people to create a better world themselves. And that may be why, we don't teach it that way. If you were able to teach, if you were able to import into the lesson plans of a U.S. history teacher, the real, actual, accurate beginning to end telling of a certain episode in the civil rights movement, what would it be and why?
Well, there's actually a good example of this was the Freedom Schools in Freedom Summer, Mississippi, 1964, when they actually went in and taught Black kids their rights, which was actually illegal to teach to Black kids. They also taught them foreign languages because foreign languages were not taught in any Black schools in Mississippi. They basically liberated these kids. One of the Freedom Schools did something I love. They studied the Declaration of Independence, and then the teacher said, why don't you write your own declaration? And they did. It was a Declaration of Independence from segregated Mississippi. They said, we have a right to have police protect us instead of beating us. We have a right to pave streets in our neighborhood. We pay taxes, and that should pay for some asphalt around here. We have, most of all, have a right to vote. This was not something that was told Black people in the South. Fannie Lou Hamer famously said she didn't know she had the right to vote until I think it was James Bevel and a couple of other civil rights workers came by and said, you really do have the right to vote. And she said, well, it's hard enough to register here, let alone vote. But that really did bring about change. I think the key thing that isn't taught is how effective the civil rights movement was. It really did change things. And sometimes it doesn't feel that way these days. I think this nation is going through a horrible time. I wake up every morning just stunned by the situation we're in. Yes, there are some bright lights. I was really pleased and surprised to see the UAW work so successfully in its strikes and in a targeted, thoughtful, careful way achieve their goals. But the civil rights movement, it's not taught how they did what they did. Rosa Parks is a great example. The way the civil rights movement is taught, the summary that goes is Rosa Parks sat down, Martin Luther King stood up, and the civil rights movement was won. Well, that neglects the years of thoughtful preparation and organization that went into it every damn step of the way. Rosa Parks is a great example. Before she made her demonstration on a Birmingham Montgomery city bus, she actually had gone to the Highlander School, a great labor and civil rights school in the hills of Tennessee. And she sat down with a woman named Septima Clark, another great organizer. Septima Clark was the daughter of a slave in South Carolina, had become a school teacher, and then lost her job for the crime of belonging to the NAACP. She's working at the Highlander School. She meets with Rosa Parks. They talk about the situation in Montgomery. The first question she asked Rosa Parks at the beginning of the week is, what do you want to do? And they work for a week and talk for a week. And at the end of the week of thinking about organizing and preparation and self-discipline, Septima Clark poses a second question to Rosa Parks. What are you going to do? And that's where the Montgomery bus boycott begins. It begins in Rosa Parks' mind with her decision about what she is going to do. And then the great organization that enables the Montgomery bus boycott to go on for over a year. All of it to make it sustainable and to impose cost on the opposition that the opposition doesn't understand at the time and is unable to respond to. That's the key to how these things work. Everybody knows what the civil rights movement did, they think. Few people know how they did it. And that's what I tried to talk about in this book. How did the civil rights movement actually do what it did?
I'm interested in what you think of today's social movements. I mentioned today that it seems to me that, all of this, the tactics and the discipline and the strategy is just really not there by and large. But I'm interested in your analysis.
I've come away thinking, really inspired by studying James Lawson, is that the worst thing you can do is have a big demonstration, everybody pat each other on the back and go home. The size of a demonstration doesn't matter. The sustainability of a demonstration is what matters. The fact that you can do it again and again and again. I think sometimes all a big demonstration do is blow off steam, and that's the worst thing, because the opposition has seen the worst you can do, and they shrug it off and they go back to doing whatever they're doing, and they're not going to change. You're going to bring about change by sitting down in quiet rooms and talking about who you are, what you want to do. First, defining yourself, and then going out and thinking about a long-term approach to achieving that. And I keep on going back to what Diane Nash said. She defines herself and her group as people who will no longer tolerate segregation. And when she's told, they're going to kill you, she said, well, that's, we understand that. But that's not our problem. That's their problem. We are not going to live with what they're telling us we have to live with. And I think once you make that decision that you are going to define yourself, I think that's so key, not to let other people define you. I got to say, I'm guilty of a little definition here. When you guys came on your show, I was just surprised to see two young people. I am so accustomed to thinking of labor organizers as old guys like me. I think it's good to see young people. And And I think it's also good if the labor movement is democratic in that it holds elections and has turnover. I remember the first contract that I ever had as a union member, they screwed the younger people by preserving the wages of the older people. Now, I know why those old guys wanted to keep their wages, but they made a deal basically on the backs of guys like me in our 20s. That's why it's important that the labor movement also be democratic and have votes that allow change and interchange and new leaders to emerge.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that and appreciate your comments as well. And I just, I think there's a lot of lessons that we can take regardless of what movement background that you're coming from, but whether it's labor or elsewhere, I think there's a lot of lessons we can really take from this and learn from this history. And I really appreciate your strategic focus here, because that's the sort of thinking that we have to have to actually make a difference. And some of us do believe that we do need to make a difference, and we're not going to do it unless we do it. Right. So really appreciate that. Sorry, Jacob, didn't mean to intervene, but
I want to intervene here. One last thing I want to say. Every book you write, after you finish the book, you start having regrets. You realize things that I should have emphasized more. One thing I really should have emphasized more in this book was the key role of organized labor in supporting the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King and the people around him, Andrew Young, Ralph Abernathy, SNCC, they had two key sources of money. Basically, Hollywood, Harry Belafonte became the conduit for collecting money in Hollywood and actually sometimes flying with a briefcase full of cash to Selma or Montgomery or Birmingham and handing it over so they could go out and buy food for people who were demonstrating. The other was the unions, UAW, several other unions, electrical workers were very dependable. ACME, the government workers in New York City, very dependable in supporting and helping the civil rights movement at key times. And that's something I wish I'd written more about. There's a whole book to be written on the financing of the civil rights movement, how it worked, how important it was, and labor, organized labor, played an important and even revolutionary role in that.
I think that's really interesting, and I definitely think that's a history that we have to remember because, labor has its own very mixed history when it comes to issues of race, when it comes to issues of gender and just justice more broadly. And so it's worth really lifting up where labor has gotten it right and was on the right side of history and used its power for the greater good. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yep. Thomas Ricks, author of Waging a Good War, How the Civil Rights Movement Won Its Battles. Really appreciate your time. Is there anything else that you'd want to leave our audience with before we let you go?
No, but hang in there. I think this country's going through a weird time. I never expected it. Boy, has my generation screwed it up. I think it's time for people in their 20s to take over this country. I would recommend, if you haven't already, get Representative Justin Jones in Nashville on your show. I spoke with him in Nashville last year before he became famous, actually, before he'd taken office. And it was one of the best moments that made going out on book tour worthwhile. One thing that really struck me is Justin Jones had studied these issues of organization. He's using them today. He's the guy who, when he walked in, they kicked him out of the legislature twice because he says things that the guys don't like. After the school shootings outside Nashville, he didn't say anything. He walked into the state legislature holding a baby's coffin. That was a striking moment. This is a guy who understands the moment and how to respond. At the end of our meeting where we spoke to people at the Nashville Public Library, I was really struck. Justin Jones stood up and said, "Would you join me in singing?" And he sang, "We Shall Overcome."
I love it.
Yeah. And we actually have we have something that we're working on for a couple of weeks from now that we actually had him on the list to reach out to. So we may be able to get him on the show. And I was first introduced to him in 2018 when I heard him open for Nina Turner at a rally. So yeah, I'm a little bit familiar with him as well, even before he kind of became something of a national sensation. So,
Well,
sir, I appreciate
luck and hang in there, guys.
Yeah, thank you so
Thanks.
much.
Appreciate your time. All right, folks. Like I said, Thomas Ricks, Waging a Good War, How the Civil Rights Movement Won Its Battles. It is an analysis of military strategy in the Civil Rights Movement. Check it out. It's good. I'm looking forward to finishing it. And I know that once I finish it, I'm going to have a few questions that that I'm going to wish I had asked, but that's just the way that it goes.
Yeah, I really have enjoyed it so far, and enjoyed the conversation with Tom. And I just, I think the more we in this movement can think strategically and look at what works and what doesn't work, and what we're doing wrong and what we're doing right, I think, we just have to be doing that because labor has been encircled. Labor has been on a 50-year decline. That's not acceptable. And we see it in the conditions that are faced by working class people in this country, and particularly here in the South. It is not acceptable. We can't keep getting those results. So yeah, I think it's a very timely book. I think it's something worth studying, and the more we can realize what works in social movements and what's effective, the better we'll be, because we have to make positive change in this country. It's long overdue.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.